Hi, this is Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, joined by Sheldon Richmond, the vice president of the foundation. This is the Libertarian Angle, the show that brings you the libertarian perspective on the burning issues of the day, the perspective that you're certainly not going to get in the mainstream press, and especially not on this crisis in Ukraine, where the mainstream press, as I write in my blog today, is just parroting the official line of the national security state, both in Russia, where the mainstream press is doing it there, and here in the United States, where the mainstream press is doing it here. And Sheldon, one of the most amusing part of this crisis occurred this last Sunday when I read in the New York Times that the U.S. government is now engaging in a policy of containment. I mean, here we have the old Cold War mentality right back up again, going back to the Truman Doctrine of where we needed to protect the whole world against the communist threat, and the dominoes were going to fall, which of course led to the Korean War, where American men died for nothing, and the Vietnam War, where another 58,000 American men died for nothing, along with, all the interventionism that took place, the regime change operations, the assassination attempts, the whole dark side activity of the Cold War. We're back there, where they're talking about Russian militarism and expansion and empire and stuff. And of course, what they don't talk about in the mainstream press is the role that the U.S. national security state, specifically through NATO, did in instigating this crisis, with the expansion of NATO into the Eastern European countries that had been part of the Warsaw Pact, the Baltic countries, and then, of course, asking Ukraine to join, or wanting Ukraine to join NATO, which would have put the military base, the Russian military bases in Crimea, directly under NATO control. I mean, how can they not see this in the mainstream press? That this was that the Russian response was a logical outcome out of what NATO and the U.S. national security state was doing.
Well, that was a really strange article because when I was reading it, I thought that maybe there was some computer glitch and they picked up an article from, roughly 1991 and recycled it. Because if you look at what the U.S. and NATO have done since the fall of the Soviet Union, it has been pressing the Cold War and attempting to, quote, contain Russia. Not that Russia had done anything that needed containing, but, after all, it had just retrenched and fallen apart. The Soviet Union did. It seemed a little odd that in 2014, we're now having an article on the front page of the New York Times saying containment of Russia, the new Obama policy. This was the Clinton policy. It was the Bush first. It was the Bush second policy. This is not new. They've been moving eastward after breaking their promise to Gorbachev that NATO would not move eastward. Since then, NATO has incorporated the Warsaw Pact countries, which was the Soviet alliance that countered NATO, and then not only the Warsaw Pact countries, but the actual the former republics, countries that were republics incorporated into the Soviet Union, some of those as well. And they've been, of course, talking about Georgia and Ukraine, who would both of which would eagerly join if offered outright membership. They're already kind of quasi-members. They're part of NATO's Partnership for Peace program, so they're essentially members. They're not formally. And plus, the U.S. has cut deals, military and otherwise, with the stands, those Central Asian republics that used to be incorporated in the Soviet Union. Muslim dominated. So there have been all kinds of aggressive moves against Russia, but those don't count. Those don't get much talked about. All that's looked at is Putin's moves in a vacuum, and then they're portrayed to the American people as hostile to the West.
Yeah, you almost get the sense that for the Pentagon and the CIA, the Cold War never really ended. That they wanted Russia to surrender. They didn't like this idea of just a passive end of the Cold War. They wanted Russia to submit to their jurisdiction and to their control, just like so many other countries around the world do. And you see this with respect to the dismantling of NATO. I mean, that's all they had to do once the Cold War was over. If they were really sincere and said, hey, the Cold War is over, then why not dismantle NATO? I mean, NATO was brought into existence for the particular purpose of waging the Cold War, along with the whole national security state apparatus, the CIA, the whole military-industrial complex, as President Eisenhower called it, the NSA. So why didn't these things go out of existence? And my hunch is because the military and the CIA, for them, this was victory. That this justified the continuation of their Cold War empire, and they couldn't stop. They had to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And one of the things that characterized John Kennedy, who was one of the few, well, I think the only president to stand up to the national military-industrial complex, the national security state, was that Kennedy was able to put himself into the shoes of the Russians and say, let's figure out why they're making these moves. And this is what Obama cannot do. It's what many of the mainstream people cannot do. But when you look at it from the standpoint of the Russians, their response is totally logical. When you've got this national security state encircling Russia, getting closer and closer, proposing anti-defense missile systems. I mean, imagine if Russia were today to announce that Cuba, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Bolivia, and Mexico had joined the Warsaw Pact. They were reconstituting the Warsaw Pact, and that Russia was now going to be moving troops and armaments and defense systems into these countries. Isn't it easy to predict the response of the Pentagon and the CIA to that type of thing? Why is it that the mainstream press cannot understand that the Russian moves in response to what NATO's been doing are totally logical? It's no different from what our national security state would be doing in response.
Yeah, I think Obama's letting himself be used. I think he's fundamentally a weak person and doesn't really think for himself much on these things. He's letting himself be used by the neoconservatives in his own State Department and Kerry, who I would basically is essentially a neoconservative, and he's letting this drive him. He doesn't, his heart doesn't really seem to be in this when he discusses it. You don't really get convinced that he's speaking from his own conviction. I think he's really being used and letting himself be used. But no, what you're saying is right. There was no desire to dismantle the Cold War apparatus. It was lining too many people's pockets. It was also assuring American dominance. And this has always been, American leaders, in my view, are just being American leaders. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of its history. The idea was the U.S. was going to be number one economically, politically, in all the respects. No one should ever be in a position to, in any way, challenge that or be competitive with that. That meant having a dominance over resources, and if not direct dominance, certainly resources in the hands of friendly regimes that would not be non-aligned or aligned with anybody else, in other words, only aligned with the United States, so that world events could be manipulated. And it doesn't mean they could carry this out, because they're not going to be omnipotent, even if they achieve their ends. But they certainly wanted to give it a try. And so they've sold to the public, and you see it in the media coverage, this very odd logic. You start off with the premise that Putin and the Russians are bad and not to be trusted. Then that means you can do anything you want to them, and any response on their part, however it may seem reasonable, doesn't count, because they're bad and not to be trusted. So it's just one of these self-fulfilling prophecies. It's like a perpetual motion machine again. And you see it in the news coverage, where very little attention is given to the eastward march of NATO, pushed by the United States, all the way up to the doorstep of the Russians. So that's barely mentioned. And even when it is mentioned, over the weekend I saw an interview with the AEI's Leon Aaron. He was asked, well, what about the people who say that Putin is really just responding to NATO coming up right to the doorstep over the many years? And he said, well, what would you expect an expansionist like Putin to say and think? In other words, that doesn't count. They didn't even establish whether it's true or not. Of course, it is true. Aaron didn't even feel like he needed to rebut it. Oh, yeah, okay, I'll concede that we've moved NATO all the way over to Russia. But that can't possibly justify anything Russia does in response, or Putin does in response. Why? Because, as I said, the premise is Putin and Russia are bad and can't be trusted, period. So we can do anything, and they're wrong and we're right.
Well, right, and they expect Russia to just submit and follow orders and do as they're told. And if NATO and the U.S. national security state surrounds them and puts missile systems, even points nuclear weapons at them, that's just tough. They're supposed to just meekly bow, kneel, and kiss the ring of the empire, and that's not going to happen. I mean, Russia's got a long history. Very proud people. They're not about to do that. But the result of that, of course, is the crisis, and which is the coin of the realm of the national security state here at home, just like it is in Russia. And your point, I couldn't help but partly smile when you said, that you can't trust them. You can't trust them. You can't trust them. I mean, that's what U.S. officials are saying and their supporters. And it brought to mind how they must be chomping at the bit to bring up the communist bugaboo here, because remember that old line of you can always trust a communist to be a communist during the entire Cold War. And the idea was that, hey, you can't negotiate with the Soviet Union. You can't end the Cold War. This thing's going to go on to total victory or that's it, either total victory or defeat. And so there was many times during the Kennedy administration where the Pentagon was actually proposing a first nuclear strike on the Soviet Union, because their mind was the only way this can end is by war. And what concerns me is that there's a lot of people with that same kind of mindset here, is that they see this as communists, and they're pushing this dangerously into a confrontation with a power that's got nuclear weapons. I mean, we would like to think that both sides are rational, that nothing could get out of hand here, but you never know. And when you look at this chaos now in Ukraine, where you've got effectively a secessionist movement that's taking place in the eastern part of the country, aligning itself with Russia, you've got people getting killed here. I mean, this is a typical outcome, isn't it, Sheldon, of U.S. interventionism? I mean, if you look at Guatemala, where they ousted the democratically elected president of the country under this Cold War mindset that he was a communist and a socialist that believed in socialist ideas, you end up with a civil war in Guatemala that lasts decades, that kills over 1 million people. And now it looks like we may very well see a civil war in Ukraine. We look at the chaos in Iran as a result of U.S. interventionism in '53. We saw what happened with the Chilean people that had to live under the brutal dictatorship of a military general for 15, 18 years or so. I mean, this is the same thing we have to see time and time again with U.S. interventionism. It's really pathetic.
The conventional wisdom was when the Soviet Union existed, the U.S. and NATO were containing it. But Noam Chomsky back then said, no, that's actually not how it works. The Soviet Union is containing the United States and NATO. And we now see that Chomsky was right, because we'll take the Soviet Union away, falls apart in 1991, and we have NATO expanding all the way to the Soviet Union, to Russia, and getting involved in areas that weren't even part of the initial charter of NATO. I mean, Libya, Afghanistan. Why are NATO in Libya and Afghanistan? What's that got to do with the initial rationale for NATO, which was, I think you put it as waging the Cold War, but to be more specific, it was simply to be defense against a Western move by the Soviet Union into Western Europe. So it was defensive, which means, as you say, it should have disappeared when the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact disappeared. Instead, it got beefed up and moved all the way to the Russian border, taking in its former allies and former Soviet republics, and then cutting deals with other former republics. So, there's an old line about how you can always tell your enemy by how he reacts to your threatening him. There's a self-fulfilling prophecy here. We're going to prove Russia's bad by doing things that provokes Russia to do things that that look bad. Well, okay, great. What have you proved? I don't know what you proved, but I know you're risking war. The United States is now going to put some troops in eastern Poland. It's a small number right now, but it doesn't take many to be a tripwire. Really only takes one, doesn't it, to be a tripwire? And now they're going to be in eastern Poland. So what else are we going to do? it's a time to be worried. I don't know what's going on in Obama's mind. Like I say, he doesn't really seem to have his heart in this, but he's allowing himself to be driven by people who definitely want to humiliate Russia and drive any wedge between Obama and Putin. They've been cooperating on other things, like in Syria and in Iran, and there are people that don't like that.
Yeah, you bring up an interesting point about these alliances that have now been entered into, and I wonder how many times the American people think about that the American people have now, by virtue of the fact that Poland and all these other Eastern European countries and Balkan countries are now part of NATO, the American people have pledged the lives of their young men and possibly their young women too in the defense of these countries. I mean, that to me is incredible. That we come from a country, the United States, that was founded on the principle of no entangling alliances, to one that now young American men may be drafted. And if there's a war with Russia and Poland, for example, how many people realize that that the United States has to come to the defense of Poland now in that kind of war? That to me is an amazing thing. When we did our tour, our recent college tour up in the Northeast, I remember telling one young guy, he's an American student that was pro-interventionist. I said, don't discount the possibility that you may be finding yourself, along with a lot of other people in your age group, on some barren field in Europe with your guts hanging out, wondering what the heck you're doing dying there in the defense of Poland in a war that doesn't involve the United States at all, except as part of that alliance. And I could tell his eyes got real big. I said, because, they're still registering for the draft, which means that they're subject to being called up and sacrificed for whatever great cause the national security state deems it necessary. I mean, they sacrificed 58,000 people of my generation for nothing on a lie, a bunch of lies in the Vietnam War, where they said, the dominoes are going to fall and the communists are going to take over and so forth. Well, Vietnam fell and I didn't see any dominoes fall. And so I think it's absolutely ludicrous, outrageous, that the lives of the American people have been pledged in the defense of all these countries here, especially when it's our side that's instigating the aggression, that is provoking the crisis.
Yeah, for the record, I was looking over the NATO treaty. It's not very long. It's easy to read. Article 5, the famous Article 5, which says that an attack on one member is an attack on all, also does say, just for the record, that the response by the individual countries, other members, and the group together, they should take what responses deemed necessary. So I think there's some wiggle room there. That doesn't give me a lot of comfort, but it doesn't mean we're automatically at war. I like how Obama was asked whether he said he was asked over the weekend during his press conference, maybe it was Friday. He said somebody said to him, "You've said many times that all options are on the table with Iran, or are all options on the table with Russia?" And he said, "Well, the military option is not on the table." I thought that was very interesting. I would have loved to see that followed up with, "Why don't you end draft registration by an executive order?" I think Carter put it in by executive order. It could be undone by executive order. I'd love to see somebody ask him that. But I think it also shows what a bully the United States is. So we can bully Iran because obviously the U.S. could wipe out Iran in a moment, and it could do nothing in response. So we can put all options on the table, including the military and nuclear weapons with Iran. But Russia, that's another story. They have nuclear weapons pointed at us, and so suddenly we're not so tough, right? We talk about some sanctions targeted at Putin's friends, but suddenly he's not such a tough talker when it's someone who can maybe punch back. So that should tell you something. The other thing is, a bit like you were saying about the going to die for one of these NATO countries. I would love an experiment. Some reporter or some libertarian ought to go outside of a recruiting station, or more than one around the country, and when people are going in, to maybe some young men and women going in, just to take a clipboard and say, "I'm just taking a survey. Would you be willing to die for Donetsk or Slovyansk?" And of course, they would wonder where those places are, and you could then tell them that they're in eastern Ukraine, and the Russians seem to have designs on them. Are you willing to die for those cities? And I would like to see the response from people.
Yeah, and I'd like to see the response of the women. Would you like to see your son die for this? Would you like to see your husband die for this? Would you like to see, your children die for this, your husband? I mean, that's the thing, is that people, they think about this too late. And let's face it, Sheldon, if there's a war that breaks out, rational thinking is going to be in short supply. We're going to hear all the same stuff we heard after 9/11. Where, they attacked us, we didn't do anything, we were just minding our own business, you hate America, stand up for your government in this time of trouble. And so now's the time when the American people should be reflecting and thinking about this and reevaluating the whole paradigm of the national security state. I mean, I remember when Ron Paul was in that presidential debate in 2008, in that campaign, where he said they came over here to kill us because we, the U.S. government, was over there killing them. And he created this huge uproar. The other candidates got all upset about it. But that was really the start of Paul's campaign. And really the principle applies here too. Notice that the Russians aren't over here. They're not even in the Western Hemisphere aligning up countries. We, the U.S. national security state, NATO, is over there. And so you've got this new crisis now with Russia. How convenient is that? The national security state, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA says, see how important we are? Well, they're the ones that are in the midst of this crisis. In fact, they're the instigators of this crisis through this NATO expansion. And didn't the same thing happen after 9/11? Oh, we have nothing to do with this. Well, as you and I showed, and Libertarians showed, both before 9/11 and after 9/11, and as Chalmers Johnson showed in his great book, Blowback, a book I highly recommend to everyone, that the U.S. national security state, the Pentagon, the CIA, were doing very bad things to people in the Middle East that gave rise to the anger and hatred that brought about not only 9/11, but the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center, the attacks on the embassies in East Africa, the USS Cole, and the string of terrorist attacks since then. And so there's a common denominator here, isn't there? The U.S. government over there. And that's why we've got to keep talking to people, Sheldon, about dismantling this whole paradigm of the national security state. Cold War is over, and all they're doing is creating new crises with this apparatus.
Well, it's a tough job because it sounds like most people are nationalists. I mean, the polls haven't shown any great desire to get involved over there. But that could change, and you're right, it could change with some incident, which, could easily happen. An American gets shot in eastern Poland, or something happens, and before you know it, war fever is raging. We've seen that happen in the past, so I don't put a lot of confidence in polls. That may be how people see things right now. But, events are fluid, and there's lots of propaganda flowing. Like I say, the news coverage, I think, is really bad. I mean, we've seen a lot of bad stuff over just since 9/11, but the news media, never fails to top itself in presenting this sort of nationalist story, where the enemy of the day is the reincarnation of evil, usually Hitler, and the U.S. is pure as the driven snow. And history began the day that Russia went into Crimea, or annexed Crimea. And, there's nothing that happened before that could have possibly brought this about. And it's the idea that, the U.S. can provoke and provoke and provoke, and no response is ever justified. And I say this without being a defender of Putin. I don't think I'd want to live under Putin. I don't think I'd want to live in the shadow of Russia. But that doesn't justify then the U.S. engaging in all kinds of hostile actions, which, humiliate Russia, and worse than humiliation, attempt to isolate it economically and other ways. Just because, Putin's not Thomas Jefferson doesn't mean you're justified in doing anything you want to the guy. And then when he does something essentially defensive, for you to say, oh, look at this, aggression. I mean, that's a totally dishonest way to present the story to the American people, who are very impressionable, right? Give them enough of this. Put Christiane Amanpour on TV enough at CNN telling us how we have to go to war with Russia, and people will sooner or later come to believe it.
Hey, I think they know exactly what they're doing. I mean, you take any dictator in the world. Usually it's going to be, well, always, it's going to be somebody very arrogant, very pompous, and it's easy to push his buttons, to provoke him. I mean, Roosevelt was doing this with the Japanese. When Roosevelt wanted into World War II and he knew the American people were opposed to it, he knew that he needed a back door. The Germans had not taken his bait, so he goes and starts provoking the Japanese. And he succeeded in getting the Japanese to respond. It's not that difficult to push the buttons of some dictator any more than it's difficult to push the buttons of President Obama or most other U.S. presidents. I mean, all you have to do is start insulting them and insulting them from a personal basis and accusing them of different things, and they get angry and heated. And so I think there's a good possibility that NATO knew exactly what they were doing as they started getting closer and closer and closer, that ultimately Russia was going to respond. And why would they do that? Because they need crises. The crises and fear are the core of the realm. And I recall back when Truman had his big containment doctrine and his big anti-communist threat. I forget the U.S. senator, but the name of it. But the senator told Truman, "You're going to have to scare the hell out of the American people to get this whole warfare state, garrison state machinery into place, because after previous wars, the whole apparatus would just dismantle. You send all the troops home and discharge them." Not this time. And the idea was, let's scare the American people. And that's been the case throughout the history of the national security state. Crises, crises, crises. Remember the Saddam Hussein crises throughout the 90s when the Cold War ended and they were scared that people were talking about a peace dividend. Oh, Saddam Hussein's going to come with his WMDs and mushroom clouds, the same type of nonsense that we hear with Iran today. And when they got Saddam, then it's the terrorist threat, the Islamo-fascist threat. Notice that we don't ever hear about the Islamo-fascists anymore, Sheldon, because they got now Russia or, parentheses, the Soviet Union, communism. My hunch is they're moving into Asia, and they're going to now, that China's going to be the new standby threat. They're already calling it our rival. And my hunch is that that's the new standby threat over there. So this is what I think they do this on purpose. They need crises. They look for crises.
Well, they haven't totally forgotten Al-Qaeda, so I have to take issue with one of your statements about Islamofascism. They've been showing a video, of course, all weekend about some high-level meeting that went on in Yemen of Al-Qaeda types, and Al-Qaeda brazenly videoed it in high res and put it on YouTube, and then they made 2 strikes in Yemen, drone strikes, along with Yemeni ground forces, and on 2 different occasions, and killed a bunch of people they claim were militants. We don't know how many were militants, how many were civilians. So they haven't forgotten about Al-Qaeda. On the other hand, that policy is totally screwed up because they're on Al-Qaeda's side in Syria. Why? Well, one reason is Russia's on the Syrian government side, so we have to take the opposite side of that, which puts us on Al-Qaeda's side. Tell me how that makes any sense. Just like we helped Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda types come to power in Libya. So, there's a lot of this doesn't seem to make sense, but it does make sense if you see they want to drive a wedge between Russia and the United States, that they want to take Israel's line on absolutely everything, which means do anything to hurt Iran and anything to hurt Russia, because Russia is, Iran's ally. But on the other hand, Russia has been helping Obama. And so even if you're a U.S. national security type, it seems to me you'd still be a little worried about this because, American stuff moves through Russia to Afghanistan. So anybody that wants to prosecute the war in Afghanistan ought to be worried about something that drives a wedge between Russia and the United States. Because if Russia said, okay, no more, you can't cross over, that's going to create a problem for the United States. It's also helping to destroy Assad's chemical weapons. Russia is. It's also helping get Iran to talk about its nuclear program, which is not a weapons program, and that's another subject. But my point is, it's cooperating with sort of the establishment line and the establishment forces on many, many things, and yet they don't seem to mind jeopardizing all of that with this. It doesn't, what are they thinking?
Well, and let's not forget the hypocrisy involved here. I mean, you mentioned Syria. Let's not forget that Assad, the dictator in Syria, who they're now trying to oust, and they're aligned with Al-Qaeda and the other people that are trying to oust Assad, that Assad was once the partner of the U.S. national security state. I mean, remember, they used Assad to torture that guy that they renditioned that was a Canadian citizen. The CIA struck a secret deal. We still don't know how the deal was struck, but where the Assad regime, which is a brutal dictatorial regime, no question about that, but was torturing on behalf of the U.S. government. And the same with Saddam Hussein. Remember that Saddam Hussein was a partner of the U.S. national security state before they turned on him. And we see the partnership with the Egyptian military goons that are out there killing, oppressing people. That apparatus has been built up by the U.S. government. So, they come into these crises saying they support democracy and so forth. Well, except in Ukraine, where they oust the democratically elected president of the country and install an unelected regime and call that freedom. I mean, there's just so much hypocrisy, and that's why it's so critically important, Sheldon. I mean, that's why we did this tour with these college students, is that the American people raise their vision to a higher level. Instead of just trying to figure out what's the solution to this crisis and this crisis and this crisis, to start recognizing that the core element behind most of these crises is the U.S. national security state itself. That's on the warfare state side. We haven't even addressed the welfare state side. But what we're talking is in terms of dismantling this machine that is at the crux of these crises, that it has no role in the America that we know it, the role established by the founding fathers of this country, that we're against this type of totalitarian edifice within a free society. Anyway, we're out of time. That's the show. That's the Libertarian Angle for this week. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.